Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 25th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. I'm Jennifer Andre Grossman. My friends know me as Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society, which is the leading objectivist organization introducing young people to the literature and ideas of Ayn Rand. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Michael Shellenberger. Before I even get into introducing Michael, I want to remind all of you guys, I think we have record numbers on Zoom to please type in your questions. You know what to do. Also, all of you that are watching our live stream on YouTube, just type your questions in. I will get to as many of them as possible. So please keep them short. Michael is author of the best-selling book, Apocalypse Never. He is a lifelong environmentalist, an activist. He's been fighting for a cleaner environment for decades, was even named Time Magazine's Hero of the Environment. But he's growing concern about what he saw as a lack of science in the public discussion on climate change, as well as a kind of apocalyptic outlook and partisanship in the environmental movement, inspired him to write this book. Michael has saved the world's last unprotected redwoods in Humboldt County, California, near and dear to my heart. He's a supporter of nuclear energy, having done 4 TED Talks on the topic. He writes on a variety of topics, including homelessness and California's forest fires, as someone who lost their house in a California fire and rebuilt. I'm really eager to hear what you have to say on that. Michael has quite the fan club in the Atlas Society, all the way from our chairman of the board, Jay LaPierre, who brought this book to our attention, to our Atlas advocates who recently did a book club on Michael's book, and he also graciously joined us for that. So Michael, welcome again. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So Michael, what is the biggest potential harm posed by climate alarmism in your opinion? And what do we have to gain, particularly with regards to taking concrete and productive positive action on the environment by abandoning this discourse of fear?
Yeah, I think there's 3 broad areas where climate alarmism is causing harm. The first is the impact in terms of our relationship to the developing world. The World Bank used to support development. Now it supports underdevelopment or the persistence or the sustainability of poverty. The second is the impact on young people in particular, but just on the psychological and mental health of people in all sorts of the world. About half of humans around the world, according to a very large survey that was done, think that climate change could make humans go extinct. There's zero science to support that. There's not even very much science fiction to support that. And the science fiction that does exist is not very good, by the way. And then the third is that it just actually undermines the policies that we need to protect the environment, ironically. So if you think of one of the biggest problems I think maybe the biggest environmental problem in the world is just, poor people working as small farmers, trying to eke out a living on the forest frontier in places like Brazil or Central Africa, who are basically being denied actively by, European Greens and Americans and the World Bank the main drivers of development, which is urbanization, industrialization, a chance to seek a better life in the city, more freedoms for everybody, including women and children, but also a solution to the environmental problems that are created by having a lot of frontier agriculture in particular, which both threatens species, but also, as we've seen with the coronavirus, is probably a main vector for the spread of zoonotic viruses from animals to humans. And so we now know that that kind of poverty, that kind of agriculture is actually a threat to all of us in the form of new diseases.
So you just cited that astounding statistic that half of the global population believes that there's a very good chance that the human population is going to become extinct, and that there's zero evidence for that. Why has this kind of alarmism thrived despite a massive body of evidence to the contrary? And how do we push back against this narrative of doom and gloom?
Well, you're right that the narrative has persisted and in some ways gotten worse over the decades, despite the evidence all going in the opposite direction, basically. I mean, you have to remember that there's prior scares, prior environmental scares have been around too many people. In fact, the height of that scare, which was in the late 60s, is also when the rate of population growth peaked and started to decline. We now know that the human population will almost certainly peak at 9 to 11 billion, and that for it to peak at the lower number, which most of us that care about the natural environment would like to see, that would mean more wealth and prosperity and industrialization for places like Central Africa, not less. And so, unfortunately, despite the, so many of these trends, I mean, there's, let me just name a few. Carbon emissions peaked in Britain, France, and Germany in the mid 70s. They peaked in the United States 13 years ago. We're in a transition from coal to natural gas. Everybody agrees natural gas is better than coal. Just have to just cook in your kitchen, and you know that you would rather be cooking with gas than with coal. So it's a very benevolent transition. But unfortunately, yeah, the alarmism has just gotten worse and worse. And I've had people sort of say to me, why, if you're an environmental activist, a climate activist, why are you pushing back on the alarmism? Doesn't the alarmism help? I compare it to being like a doctor that works on cancer, for example. So if you work on cancer, we're getting much better at treating cancers. Like, it's this huge success story. Like, we're turning a lot of cancers into chronic diseases, like we've now done with HIV/AIDS. It's this major thing we should be celebrating and seeking to provide for everybody in the world. And so if somebody was coming along saying that, billions of people are going to die from cancer, which in one sense is actually true over several decades, but for somebody to come along and say the world's going to end because of cancer, you'd kind of be like, that's actually communicating the wrong information. Things are getting better. So in the book, just in short, the last 3 chapters of the book describe what I see as the underlying causes of the alarmism: money, power, and religion. Ultimately concluding that climate alarmism and environmental alarmism more broadly, which stems from the intellectual class and of scientists and media and elites, is really an alternative religion. It's really the new dominant secular religion. You might kind of group it with, Black Lives Matter or other kind of left-wing movements as really an alternative religion to the decline of Judeo-Christianity. And so I conclude that actually, as much as we push back against it, and we should on the facts, as we've done in Apocalypse Never, that we can expect this kind of alarmism to increase because people are engaging in it really to provide their own lives with meaning and to gain some kind of status and power through conspicuous compassion and virtue signaling.
That's really interesting, because some of our viewers might be asking, really, well, what does objectivism have to do with what we're talking about right now? But of course, the sort of central tenet of objectivism is that reality exists. And of course, it's a philosophy of self-esteem, of productivity, of finding a purpose in your life and finding that purpose and living that purpose. And I think that regardless of where you ultimately end up in terms of your politics or your purpose, but when you have this existential vacuum and you just abandon trying to find your own personal purpose, you open up a need to find an alternative one. So I want to also encourage everybody, please ask your questions of Michael. This is a really unique opportunity, so just go ahead and type them in. But first, I've got a few of my own. So I thought this was interesting, Michael, that you, in terms of politics, identify as more politically left-leaning in your writings. Not a big surprise. You're in Berkeley, I think. I certainly started out much more on the left side of the political spectrum myself, and much to my parents' chagrin, have had my own evolution. But you are undeniably gaining a lot of popularity among conservatives, libertarians, and clearly in the objectivist community. Why do you think that might be?
I mean, I think the underlying reason is that we share the same values. I mean, I'm in favor of prosperity. I'm in favor of wealth. I'm in favor of individuality. I think what I share with objectivists and libertarians, if I could define it broader, I know you're not the same, is, yeah, for sure, a commitment to kind of reality and facts and science, but also committed to kind of every human is special and every human has this internal potential, and we're not victims, and we're not helpless victims of our natural environments, that we can take control over our lives. You know, much of the environmental discourse paints humans on the one hand as these kind of terrible, greedy predators and destroyers of nature. On the other hand, it depicts us as kind of helpless victims of, you know, I mean, one of the most ridiculous is sea level rise. I mean, you know, sea level, you know, climate, you know, in my view, climate change is real. We should do something about it. We are. It's not the end of the world. It's not the biggest environmental problem. Sea level rise, the median estimate sea level rise is a half a meter, 0.6 meters. That's about 2 feet over the next, you know, century. I mean, we think people can't deal with 1 centimeter sea level rise a year. I mean, it's you know, we farm 7 meters below sea level in Netherlands. If anybody has been to Venice in Italy knows that this is an entire city kind of constructed on the water. You know, we put a person on the moon. We do things technologically that are unbelievable. So this idea that sort of we're these passive, helpless victims, I reject that at a kind of primordial way. I think in the same way that probably many objectivists do, which is to say that that's just gross. It treats humans as machines or a simple stimulus response kind of behavioral view, or a kind of a view that basically is dehumanizing. So I think we share that in common. I also support market signals. I think prices contain a huge amount of information, and that Hayek is basically right about that, and that there's no substitute for it. And I point to the case of the whales, where, you know, countries that had more centralized control over supply of oils, by the 20th century, they were using whales for vegetable oils for soap and margarine. The Soviets, some of the worst whaling was done because the Soviets were avoiding market signals that were coming from vegetable oils becoming a lot cheaper and whales becoming a lot more expensive. So definitely share some stuff on that. Yeah, people are always curious. I am a Democrat. I remain a Democrat. I'm unhappy with the Democrats. I live in California, so therefore I'm unhappy with the Democrats. It's a single party state. You know, my view is that there's some services that are probably better, that are natural monopolies, that are probably better provided by the state. And we can talk about that or disagree about that. But I just think there's some things that are like that, including electricity. You know, we're in the middle of a psychiatric crisis here. And I just don't, if there's some way to solve that psychiatric crisis with market forces, I get to see it. So I think there's certainly some things that should be in the domain of collective action. But yeah, I admit that I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to Democrats in California, certainly in Berkeley as well.
Oh, well, that's for sure. And I spent most of the past year in San Francisco with my parents, and wrote an article called Vagrants in Our Driveway, a Teachable Moment. And I took a video because I heard my mother upstairs, my mother who's a Democrat and a social worker. And we were at home, and she was concerned, you know, that there was someone who was completely out of it, stumbling around half naked in the driveway. And I was saying that I thought that it was usually not a lot of upside when that happens. Wasn't probably a very good day for that individual either. But I was saying, at least from an objectivist perspective, that it was possibly a teachable moment because of the language we used. When in Ayn Rand's literature, particularly like an anthem, where the word I has been abolished, when you are so focused on, well, we use this word and we don't use that word, you not only limit debate, but you limit even your ability to think about it. And so I said, we used to have a very rich, broad vocabulary of the way that we would talk about people who were living on the streets. And some of them weren't very polite. vagrants or bums or panhandlers or beggars or whatever it might be, roustabouts. I mean, the list goes on. And now it's just homelessness. And that, at least to me, makes it think that it's about housing, as opposed to what you're talking about. Would you tell us a little bit about the writing that you're doing on that, and maybe some of your thoughts?
Sure, I'm really happy to. So I'm happy to say too, I just signed a book deal with my publisher, HarperCollins. My next book is going to be about the so-called homeless crisis in San Francisco. I agree with you. The word homelessness is a propaganda word. It's a word that is designed to make us think that the problem is essentially poverty rather than being a problem of untreated mental illness and addiction, which any of us who live here know that it is.
Right.
There are extremely poor people. I think that there are policies that we should have to help them. There are also people that are addicted to meth and sleeping on the street. Those are not the same people. I mean, sometimes they might be, but this idea that we have one word that combines all these different people, it means it's a propaganda word. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I'll make two observations. I mean, the first is that the person in your driveway, you're supposed to, if you're going to be able to have friends and polite conversation in San Francisco, you're supposed to call that person unhoused and suffering from a substance abuse disorder. That's the correct language. What you'll notice about all the language is it's all aimed at eliminating any sense of responsibility or agency or power from what they do. So the very idea that people are victims, as opposed to people that have undergone hardship and in fact have a lot of heroic potential, because victimization, of course, is a stage in becoming a hero. Victimization is part of what it takes to become a full human being that has suffered and suffers and has overcome. I'm more in the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche, which says that that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. He's not saying that's how it is for everybody. He's saying that that's what you should tell yourself. That's the attitude you should have when faced with hardship. Well, the left here, mostly the radical left, but the left here says, no, you could not possibly demand anything from anybody. It's really social worker mentality gone crazy. Not to criticize your mom at all. And my family, by the way, has social workers in it and teachers, and they're all very empathic. But we've clearly, it's not rocket science to figure out what's going on around here. I mean, you just go give people all sorts of money and benefits, and then you let them shoot drugs in public and defecate in public and sleep on the sidewalk. That's what people will do. And I think it's interesting. There's a writer who I've become really interested in. He's a psychiatrist. He's from Britain, and he describes the language that people, really the kind of the most challenged folks in our society, use to describe their circumstances. And he talks about one guy who talks about how he stabbed a guy, and he was describing it, and he said the knife went in. It was completely erased his agency and his responsibility from it. And if you think that responsibility is essential to being an adult and to transcending a kind of familial or paternalistic relationship, then what you want is to have policies that reward responsibility, that require responsibility, where there's some amount of reciprocity. And we have all sorts of words that we use to describe this relationship. We call it carrots and sticks. We call it rights and responsibilities. We call it tough love. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we basically eliminated one half of that equation, which is madness. And we see it, but we see it in the whole culture. We're all going soft, and I mean, we all know what this problem is. And it's a challenge I think you guys probably think a lot about. Certainly Ayn Rand thought about it, which is, what do you do when you become really rich and soft and coddling, and you don't create any of these strictures? I mean, what we know, I'm a father. I'm not going to claim to be the best father in the world, and like a lot of parents have a lot of regrets, but I do know that my experience with kids is that they want to have things demanded of them. People need responsibilities to give their lives meaning and purpose. And so what is a political movement doing that is depriving people a chance to feel powerful, to feel responsibility, to take control of their life? I mean, one of the worst things you can say about somebody in the Bay Area right now is you say, oh, well, that's somebody that thinks that you could just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, that would be the worst thing in the world, to think that you would actually, want people. Now, of course, look, I am still, like I said, I still think there's some role for the government here. I think there's a role to help people when they're down and out, but it should be tied to some sense of responsibility. So that's, you know, that's where the book is headed, and you just see it everywhere. I mean, it's just like they're literally. I love being asked this because you can see my poor wife and friends are just sick of me ranting about this. They're literally, harm reduction has gone from giving people clean needles so they don't transfer HIV or Hep C to each other, to providing people with meth pipes and with foil to light fentanyl on and smoke it. Like, what's the public interest in that? Like, how is that harm reduction at all? It's just enabling terrible behavior. So, you know, the punchline to it all is that it's pretty simple. You have to restore some sense of some requirement of responsibility. You have to have more strictness in how we raise our kids, including particularly how we raise our boys, because they need it more than girls need it, but everybody needs it. And that, you know, the good news is that mothers can father just as fathers can mother, and that turns out that both sexes can play these roles, but that kids need that, and they need to have things expected of them. And we all need that. And I think that we're in a moment in American life right now where nobody knows what's expected of each other. And that's why every institution in the society is failing, from the White House to Congress to the New York Times to, you know, the United Nations to CDC and World Health Organization. Every institution is in crisis in Western civilization. And I think the reason for that is because there's no vision, there's no sense of what do we owe each other as taxpayers and citizens. There's no sense of, you know, if I get something, what do I owe for it? And I think that ultimately Californians will, and Americans will, come back to this balanced place of rights and obligations, rights and responsibilities that, sure, you know, there is some obligation, I think, on the society to provide some basic shelter, particularly to people that are pretty low capacity and incapable in some ways of taking care of themselves. We have some obligation to them, but everybody can work. Everybody can do their part. Everybody can contribute. You know, I was in the Netherlands, which is one of the most liberal countries in the world, and people with pretty high levels of severe mental illness also do work. They are constantly doing work for themselves. And I think it makes social work a little bit harder. Sometimes it's easier just to provide the service than to demand things from people. But ultimately, the whole society needs to be demanding both individual and some sense of social responsibility for ourselves if we're going to solve this untreated, you know, addiction and mental illness crisis, and frankly just prosper, develop, and continue to, you know, protect and strengthen our institutions rather than allow them to be completely, you know, denigrated and dismantled.
Yeah, that there's so much there that resonates when you also talk about people with mental illness or other kinds of disabilities that can work. You know, and one of the reasons that I patronize the particular grocery stores that I do is because I see that grocery store going out of its way to provide some kinds of work opportunities for the people that, you know, it's, sometimes it can be a little strange, right? That the guy that's, you know, that bagging groceries clearly, you know, is autistic or something like that. I also did it, you know, at the Atlas Society Gala. I had my dress that was made by a Guatemalan, 23-year-old Guatemalan fashion designer who also happens to have Down syndrome, right? So we can each of us make these kind of choices as individuals, as organizations, as businesses to live our values. So we're going to get to some of these questions, but I didn't want to let you go without also asking a little bit about your origin story, Michael. Like, how did you become so interested in the environment, and what was your path? Were there people that were influences? Were there books that were influences? What was it?
Sure. Yeah, boy, a lot to talk about. Yeah, I've actually started to understand a little bit more about my family. So I am from a long line of Mennonites, which is a Christian Protestant sect that is, including in my family, was pretty anti-statist, held a lot of ideas that I think Atlas Society members would share, ironically, though others not. It's a very, they're not the Amish, but the Amish are close, and often, you know, the Amish, when you stop being Amish, you just become Mennonite. And so, for example, my grandfather's parents were Amish, and then they became Mennonites. And so in that tradition, there's a lot of radical thought, a lot of outsider thought. We were suspicious of the state, suspicious of the nation, very pacifist. My whole family was like that. I was not. I was a pacifist, and then I became more of a radical leftist. Certainly had a socialist phase. Certainly had a Marxist phase. I spent a lot of time in Latin America. I was never Malthusian. I never thought there was too many humans. I never thought there was too many people. That always struck me as racist, even from a very young age. Always loved the natural environment. Never thought there should be a conflict between people and the natural environment. And so there was always something strange about some environmentalists to me. I mean, the other part of it was I was always struck by how wealthy they were and how aristocratic so many environmental folks were compared to other left-wing movements. And then, what can I say? Mugged by reality. I lived in peasant communities in Latin America. People want prosperity. Prosperity is good. Progress is mostly good. We all suffer some of the consequences of progress, but all else being equal, we'd rather have it than not have it. Yeah, no, what else? I guess the stuff on really the stuff on markets was some of the most recent, in the sense of I never really was against that stuff, but I came to appreciate more. You get older and you just kind of understand how the world works better, and you kind of go, markets are important. So it was a gradual process. I actually did some work in Venezuela. This is the final stage of my socialism, was being in Venezuela, and it just got crazy. Like the Marxists were just nuts, and it was just, I just remember being like, there's something really kind of wrong about this at multiple levels. And I just remember that being the kind of goodbye to all that.
Straw that broke the camel's back. Well, it's interesting what you're saying about Venezuela, and we'll have to make sure that you see our latest Draw My Life, My Name is Venezuela, which we've also translated into Spanish. And after the United States, which is that's our biggest audience, the second biggest audience, the most engaged audience for the United States in the entire globe at the moment, is Venezuela. So it is interesting that there are still enough people physically there when so many have left. And I identify with your journey kind of in the reverse, because I was raised in a very liberal, more belief in state intervention background. And then I also made my, you went through your Marxist phase, your socialist phase. I went through, my Republican phase, my libertarian phase, right, objectivism. And we have here a question from the man that made this possible. He is Jay LaPierre, chairman of the board of the Atlas Society. And he wants to know, Michael, has your book made converts among environmentalists? And what are the legitimate criticism your book received, if any?
Well, unfortunately, this environment is so polarized. My book did not really get a fair hearing on the left. I've written for the New York Times and Washington Post before. I've reviewed books for the Washington Post, and neither of them reviewed the book. One of those newspapers, I won't say which, so I don't get anybody in trouble, the review editor sent back a note sort of saying that he thought it was too bad that the newspaper decided to shut me out. It's not, as you know from reading it, this is not some right-wing book. It's not even really a libertarian book. There's just nothing it's not really very ideological at all, but it got iced out of the left. So there's just a lot of people that never heard of it. I mean, it's sad, but that's just, I can't do anything about that. So unfortunately not enough. I did get some very nice notes. Some of the most rewarding notes I get are from people who were depressed about environmental problems, like especially from adolescents. Young people emailed for sure and were like, thank you, and I felt better. I know the world's not going to end, and you kind of broke it all down, and those were extremely rewarding to get. I think it has had an impact as well on the discourse. It's not as obvious to some people, but if you pay super close attention to the conversation about these things, I can see it's just slightly less acceptable to be hysterical about climate change, particularly in elite media audiences like on Twitter. Still a bunch of it around the forest fires. We saw it, which was just ridiculous. But I do think in some other areas it's gotten better. legitimate criticisms of the book. I'll say there's criticisms I've felt the need to respond to and criticisms I haven't felt the need to respond to. And the ones I felt the need to respond to, I put them on the website and I responded to them. I mean, the most substantive criticism of the book came from somebody who defended Reverend Thomas Malthus, who's the villain in Apocalypse Never. So it's funny because you're kind of like, on the one hand, environmentalists, they said, oh, Michael, you're constructing a straw man. Nobody really follows the ideas of Thomas Malthus anymore. And then the main attack on me, like they had a huge photo of Thomas Malthus's face, a painting of Malthus as an attack on Apocalypse Never. Substantively, ticky-tacky stuff. I have issued a small number of corrections that mostly were typos on the website, but nothing of significance. I will say, it's hard to ask an author what criticisms are valid, but I will say, I wasn't trying to, there were some people that were like, my book's not super original. And I think there's part of it that's true, which is that I wasn't trying to break new theoretical ground or new journalistic ground even. What I was really, I think where the novelty in the book exists is that I synthesized it. And, I was praised recently for being good at synthesizing, and it's actually something I take a lot of pride in, at being able to kind of explain some complicated ideas in a small amount of space. So for me, the book is what's special about it, and what I am proud of with the book is that it covers a lot. It covers both the debunking of the alarmism, but also tries to get at some of the deeper psychological and I think even spiritual motivations that underlie so much of the alarmism.
Speaking of motivations, we have another question here from another one of our donors, Phil Coates. Hey, Phil, great to see you, and appreciated those kind comments that you had about the Atlas Society on Carl Barney's blog. So Phil wants to know, why has the apocalyptic version of climate change taken over among scientists? And I guess first, whether or not you'd agree with that premise. Phil wants to know, are they confused, politically intimidated from speaking out? Or three, are there quite a few out there who do, like you, but just really aren't getting picked up by the media?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes.
To all
of those, yeah. One of the characters in the book is one of my favorite people in the whole world, a gentleman named Roger Pelkey Jr., who's a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and is one of the most just balanced scientists in terms of, he's famous because he shows that there hasn't been an increasing cost from natural disasters once you account for economic growth or more property in harm's way. Once you account for that, hurricanes don't cause more damage today than they did in the past. And he's suffered significantly for that. Not a victim. He's actually the hero of the book, one of the heroes of the book. But he said, he was like, look, a lot of this is just people, the majority of people are just herd animals. So I'm trying to work in all of the Ayn Rand concepts I can. That most people are just kind of follow the herd and they're obedient, and they just, most people, I mean, and I understand it, they just don't want to be criticized publicly. They don't want to be attacked on Twitter. And of course they don't. Nobody likes that. And so I just think a lot of people are just intimidated into silence. I think most scientists are not radical left and alarmist. So there's definitely a handful that are. They're true believers, every single one of them. I mean, there's financial motivations always, but the main event is I just think they're true believers. And I think it makes sense that for me, at the end of the book, I talk about how I think that, of course, the narrative that alarmist scientists say, and they want to say, is, well, I'm just more in touch with the facts, and that's why I'm so alarmist. But I think that that's not true. And I think a deeper motivation is that, remember, scientists were the first ones to struggle with purpose if you believe there's no God. And so scientists were the ones out there making the world godless, so to speak, kind of being like, look, we can explain a lot of evolution without God. We can explain a lot of things in the world without the Bible. And I think that undermined a very powerful basis for human civilization, which is the idea that our morality, that we should behave properly, because if we don't, then we will suffer for it in the afterlife or be rewarded for it. So once that's gone, I think people then search for some other ways to make meaning, and they decide to make meaning through really trying to enforce power in this new morality. And so there's been this effort in particular by alarmist scientists to do that, by activist scientists. But like I said, they're in the minority, and most people are just intimidated.
Thomas Odea has a question. He wants to know, how do you answer the question of human impact on global warming? I believe we are impacting it, but not as much as is being stated. Nature is a much bigger impact, correct? Is that your view?
Well, it depends. So it sounds like he wants to talk about climate change. So my view of climate change is pretty close to the mainstream view, which is that carbon dioxide is a heat trapping molecule. It makes sense that a lot of carbon dioxide would be contributing to warming. The mechanism is well understood scientifically, and it has been since the late 19th century. Plus, we have good observations of temperature changes. There has been some problems with land-based temperature records, but we have good temperature records for the oceans, so we know the world is getting warmer, and we see the impact of climate change. We do, and is nature playing a role? Well, of course. I mean, it's like saying, it's a funny word, nature, because it just refers to everything. So it's like, are there natural? So people might want to say, is there natural cycles? Could be, although we may have been heading towards a cooling period. In fact, a lot of scientists thought we were headed towards a cooling period, and then we're surprised when we that we got warmer, and so that is part of where the theory comes from. But I think the evidence is pretty strong, and with the book, you'll see that I sort of defend that more mainstream view of the effect of carbon and other heat trapping gases on climate change. But I just push back on the idea that we're just victims of it all, and that we can't have any control over it. In fact, I show that, that greater adversity, that fighting adversity, including in terms of where you live, whether it's Venice, Italy, or Amsterdam, can bring great achievements. Arguably the greatest achievements, the only great achievements are achieved through some sort of struggle and challenge and adversity. And so what I'm really pushing back against is the idea that this is some apocalyptic threat that we're incapable of dealing with. And I'm also pushing back against the fact that there are other things that we do to the natural environment that are pretty terrible, that we don't need to do, and that we could stop doing, like eating less wild fish, like not using biofuels at all, like not spreading garbage energy sources like, solar panels, made in China over vast landscapes, or killing birds with wind turbines. That they don't need to do those things. And so in the name of climate change, we're causing significant amounts of harm. So, but I think that the conservatives, and in some ways I wrote the book for my conservative friends, or I wrote the book for my friends on the right, which is to say, don't just be anti, the Malthusians, though that's important, but we should have a positive program. And that's a positive program that's built around, human aspiration, human development, innovation, energy transitions, intensified agriculture, and the move towards more energy dense fuels.
I think that's a wonderful way to put it. And our most recent honoree at the Atlas Society Gala in October was Peter Diamandis. And he is an environmentalist as well, but he has a perspective on technology exponentially accelerating innovation, and an optimistic perspective on the ability to overcome challenges. And I think that's part of what I'm hearing from you, because if ever we are heading into a vortex where we're able to source solutions for some of these global crises, it's now. But of course, if we enact socialism and we get rid of these sources of capital which can fund these efforts, then we're going to be in trouble. Question from Joe L. Dredd. He wants to know, have you written about Greta Broomberg? I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right. What's your opinion of her and the things that she says?
Yeah, she's a character in the book. I write extensively about Greta. She's very interesting, very important figure. I treat her as an adult, which means that I make criticisms of her substantively. I reject this idea that somehow she can denounce all of Western civilization and that anybody who responds to her is somehow picking on a girl, which has been the nature of her advocacy and her defense, which I find pretty terrible, honestly. So I treat her as the adult that she is, and I point out that what she's recommending is panic, in her own words. She says, I don't want you to have hope, I want you to panic. Well, I don't wish panic on my worst enemies. And the reason I don't do that is because what panic means is unthinking behavior and action. Like,
Right.
why would you wish unthinking behavior, particularly on your opponents? I don't think we want anybody engaging in unthinking behavior and action. And you might say, well, that's just rhetorical, Michael. Why are you making such a big deal of it? But I point out that, in fact, two radical environmentalists with Extinction Rebellion were dragged down from the top of tube cars. That's the subway in London, of course, from the tops of tube cars in a protest, and they were kicked and beaten, could have been killed. I mean, genuinely, they could have been killed. And there's been, a lot of harm, caused by that sort of rhetoric. And so I think it's irresponsible. And I also point out that at the end, at the beginning of last year, she started by talking about how poor countries need to use a lot of energy, they need to develop. She at least recognized that. By the end of the year, she was denouncing economic growth at the United Nations. And I point out, Greta Thunberg, upper middle class, child of an opera singer and an actor and stay-at-home dad who are clearly very affluent, live in very affluent circumstances. There is no Greta Thunberg without economic growth. Like, she is a product of economic growth. And it's that lack of gratitude and awareness. She came to the United States. This is after I finished the book, and I've never written about it because it's just annoying, but she did this podcast of her trip around the United States, and it was the most patronizing, insulting, talking. She was like criticizing Americans for having like cattle ranching. I mean, it's like, what do you think in Sweden they don't eat meat? I mean, it was the most kind of typical, stereotypical European put down of Americans I'd ever heard. And I'm not some like, whatever, red state, or bust guy. I live in Berkeley, for Pete's sake. But the kind of disrespect that she levels at people that share her class, actually at people that are slightly below her class, at working class people, is offensive. It's the same way that, I mean, the way that Europeans, it's a kind of European snobbery. So I think I think that ultimately, and I sort of conclude this at the very end of the book, is that a lot of this climate alarmism and an effort to try to control how countries produce energy and food has to be read as a rearguard action to protect globalization and elite privilege at a time when nations are reverting towards nationalism and working classes are asking what's in it for them, and at a time when people are asking, what does it mean to be an American? And to assert the dominance of Greta Thunberg and United Nations officials over, domestically elected governments is just terrible, and nobody wants that.
What you were saying about panic, I thought was interesting, that you certainly wouldn't want anybody, but particularly somebody who actively wished you harm, to revert to a mode of unthinking behavior. And it also struck a tone with what you were saying about the ingratitude that you observed and that you're picking up in Greta's message, and something that our chairman has talked a lot about. Is gratitude. We have a My Name is Gratitude video, and it's like, well, what, you're objectivist? How does that fit in? Because just as panic is not going to help you or anybody function in a productive, goal-oriented manner, being constantly thinking about what you need, what other people have, resenting other people, is a very disempowering, agency reducing way to move in the world. So as we move towards Thanksgiving, we definitely recommend a dose of gratitude every day, 365 days a year. John Laxmi, and we are getting to the end here, so maybe we can get to one or two short questions. Says Michael should be congratulated for the course correction he made. It would be useful to present the arguments and facts in the book in a visual documentary format. Any effort underway to do that?
Well, on the one hand, we did, in the sense that if you go to environmentalprogress.org and you go to the drop-down page for Apocalypse Never, you can see all the graphs and charts of all the scientific, or the stuff that's easy to quantify. We did do some qualitative stuff on those slides, but I mean, my colleague, by the way, Madison Serwinski, who did it, who is an amazing researcher, there's something like 200 slides of all the charts and graphs, and they are easy to download and also easy to just kind of right-click and paste into social media so people can share them. And then, yes, should each chapter of Apocalypse Never be its own episode on a Netflix documentary series? Absolutely. I would love that. I wrote, the story of the book is that I was contacted by a talent agent who, after she saw my TED Talks, wanted to see if I wanted to do a TV show about nuclear. And I said, yeah, I'm working on a book about that. And then she's like, well, do the book first, then we'll talk about the TV show. And then I did this book, and it changed in the middle, and it became this new book. And you know, I have talked to folks that want to make it into a TV show, but so far it hasn't panned out, and it's disappointing, because I think it would make for better television than a lot of stuff that's on Netflix right now. I think it would be great. And also my daughter, you know, she's 15. She's not quite into the book yet, and I really wanted her to have something for for Zoomers and young millennials and others, and people who just don't read. You know, people don't read that much. So yes, if anybody's listening, I would like a TV show on Netflix. But apparently, what the universe wants is for me to write a book about the homeless crisis in San Francisco, and so I've kind of made my peace with that. That's what I'm working on. Yeah,
and the universe wants you to write a book on fires too. I certainly would. I could do a whole chapter on that, in terms of what, from my own personal experience, I've seen that have contributed to the very precarious situation in which we find ourselves. So we have a few other questions. People are asking your thoughts on some others, like Matt Ridley. I think we also have a question about if you have any thoughts on the animated film director Hayao Miyazaki. I'm not sure who that is.
I love Hayao Miyazaki.
So
well, those are two very interesting characters. So Matt Ridley and I are friendly. I've met him in person. I like him. We don't see eye to eye on everything. You know, I did a history of the fracking revolution in the United States. I did find more U.S. government involvement than he acknowledges in his history, but you know, it's at that level of disagreement. It's not. We're good friends, and I think he's written some very fine books. Hayao Miyazaki is a very interesting character. He, of course, is the Japanese filmmaker who made his most famous movie is Spirited Away, and but he's made other movies that are absolutely some of my favorite movies in the entire world, not just animated films. I mean, I think he's a genius. I love all of his movies. And his movies are deeply nostalgic. They're actually nostalgic in an interesting way. They tend to be they're steampunk. They tend to be nostalgic for kind of early industrial revolution. They tend to be very nature nostalgic. He's definitely hardcore. I think he's a Malthusian, low energy, romantic reactionary. You know, that's who he is. And I see it in a lot of artists. I forgive it more because I think, artists have a kind of, they're romantics, right? And so they have a view that things were always better in some past period, and when we were either hunter-gatherers or farmers, or the early industrial period for Hayao Miyazaki. And I don't think it's very healthy for politics, but it seems like it's just a really deep part of art. And so for me, I don't write about Hayao Miyazaki in the book because he's not, depriving poor countries of energy. He's not a villain or anything. But it's interesting that one of the folks asked about it. I think one of the most interesting things about, I'll say also about Miyazaki's films, he made a movie called Nausicaa, I believe, where the world is polluted and contaminated, but then when they get beneath it, they discover that Earth is healing itself, that actually it's clean, that Earth is cleaning itself. And I think that's important for people to remind themselves of, is that, one of the things we found in the plastics chapter, well, the first thing, the most important thing is that you should not recycle your plastics, because the chances are that they'll end up being shipped to poor countries that don't have waste repositories and end up in the ocean. But the other thing is that the ocean actually does degrade a lot of plastics, and we should just be appreciative of our natural environment for breaking things down, and that it's not the case that our pollution is everlasting or something. That it's not an excuse to pollute, but it is to say that nature is much more resilient than we give her credit for being.
Well, I'm going to see if I can get my parents to read your book, because especially after spending several months under the same roof with them, they are religious recyclers. I mean, even to the extent that neighbors complain that my father goes out and he smashes the cans, and they're just very meticulously organized. And I said, I'm not really sure that this is doing much, and what I'm hearing you say is actually could be doing some harm to poor countries. So.
Yeah, I mean, aluminum and glass recycle really well because they're heavy, and but plastics are light, and they're made from a byproduct from oil and gas production already. So you're already downcycling. And we have these perfectly good solutions for plastic, which is incineration and landfills. The incinerators are now burning really hot and clean, and the landfills are fine. We capture the methane gas that comes off of the waste. And in fact, the waste problem, the plastic waste in the ocean problem, and it is to some extent a problem, is really a consequence of poor countries not having achieved high enough economic development to have their own waste repository system. So, if you care about, it's one of these classic things where it's like, if you care about the natural environment, then you would actually embrace prosperity and economic growth, not resist it.
So I talked about the message that I'm going to be bringing as a daughter to my parents. I would love for you as a father to bring a message to your 15-year-old daughter, that she is welcome here at the Atlas Society. I especially feel for young women. I know it was true for me that being exposed to Ayn Rand, who did things that no other women did, and wrote books in which there were very strong female heroines and role models, and yes, a few villains, was something very unique, and helped kind of give me or give myself permission to not necessarily have to conform to social expectations or be in a subservient role, but to pursue my own happiness. And we would be more than thrilled to send her a shipment if and when she's at that.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be great.
So, well, thank you again, Michael. I hope we can still continue to think about, I know that our chairman's going to have some ideas. I can hear A Draw My Life is taking shape in his head as we speak, on how to bring your message to others. What are other ways that we can learn about your work? Is the site or social media that we should be following you on?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to stay in touch, and definitely when the new book comes out next year, I'd love to come back and talk with you all. I think it's for me, it's a chance to offer a kind of new, kind of vision of how we should think about the social contract and what obligations do we owe to each other. And I hope it's appealing both to left and right, to folks in a society and people outside of it that understand that we need a new social contract. We need some way to know what is our obligation to each other as taxpayers and citizens. And so that's what the book is going to try to confront. And yeah, people should definitely stay in touch. I'm on Twitter at Shellenberger MD, which are my initials. I'm not an MD. And also on Facebook. And yeah, buy the book and send it to your relatives for Christmas, please. We need to get the book out there more.
That's great. And we will be doing what we can to get it out there, including memeing it and then linking all of those memes to this interview. And you are definitely invited back for next year as well. We will make your upcoming book a subject of the Atlas Society Book Club. And so taxpayers, citizens, and all of you out there, donors who are supporting the work, making it possible for us to bring not just the ideas of Ayn Rand and other philosophers and libertarians to the younger generation, but also new and contemporary thinkers and writers like Michael. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, Jay would not want me to get off without saying all new $5 donations between now and the end of the year are going to be tripled, essentially, because they're going to be double matched by our board. So thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Michael. Hope to maybe see you up in the Bay Area.
I'd love that. Thanks, Jennifer.
Take care. Bye.